Here at the Salem Museum, and I am really thrilled to have Ms. Archer here tonight, and really thrilled that all of you all have come out. Her story is so powerful and so important, and it's a story we all need to hear and remember. I think this is going to be an incredible evening. So I think you're going to tell your story. I don't need to tell your biography because that's your turn. So, Mrs. Archer.
In numbers. I grew up in Belgium. I was born in 1924, and I was brought to Belgium when I was a little child by my parents who emigrated from Poland. All my schooling and all my living was really in Belgium until the war broke out. I wanted to bring this map just to give you a little idea about the geography in case some people kind of forgot. Belgium is a very small country. It's bordered by Holland in the north, Germany in the right, in the east, France in the south, and right across the channel lays England. So we're surrounded with good friends most of the time. But also Belgium happens to be a country where wars are usually fought because either the Germans come in and the French come in, and it's really a bad spot to be in time of war. So if you remember, Germany started invading several countries around Germany. Can you hear me?
No.
Try now, try.
Okay, is that better?
No.
We're going to the backup plan.
All right. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Here we go. You sure that will work? Okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right.
People in the back.
Can you hear me?
Can you lift bring the microphone up and then closer to you?
You
She's
do it.
too tall for the mic. There you go.
Okay? All right.
I'll be here all week, everybody.
Germany, as you know, there was the First World War from 14 to 18. And then in 1934 and 5, Hitler started to annex or invade several countries right around Germany, to which he claimed ownership because the people spoke German, like Austria and the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia. And England and France kept appeasing Hitler and letting him get away with it, hoping that he would not go any further than that. England and France had a pact, and they stood by, and all at once Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. At this point, France and England could not take that, so they declared war. Hitler had from September till the next spring to take care of Poland in a very brutal way. And then on May the 10th, 1940, they invaded Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg in their first push towards France. So on May the 10th, 1940, we woke up to the sound of aircraft, guns, and airplanes flying, and we knew that the Germans had come across the border. My hometown is Liège, which is right over here, very close to the German border. Belgium is a very small country, so everything is close to everything else. I'm sorry. And is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, so we looked out of our window at home, and we were living on the main thoroughfare of the city. And suddenly, a few hours after the Germans crossed the border, we could see people streaming down the street, getting away from the border and the country beyond Liège to get away from the Germans. Belgium had a very bad taste from World War I, and there was only a span of 22 years between the two wars. So many people who had experienced the First World War were still living, and they remembered the brutal treatment and the terrible things that happened in World War I. So they did not want to be occupied if they could get away from them. So all these people are coming down the street. They didn't have any cars because gasoline becomes rare all at once and a car doesn't do you any good. So they came in carts, bicycles, horseback. Saw some old people pushed in a wheelbarrow going down the street trying to head west away from the Germans. People thought that they were somewhat safe in Belgium because the French and the British were supposed to be very strong with their armies. And the French had built a Maginot Line, which was supposed to hold the Germans back if they came even that far. My parents had, and the rest of my family, I had uncles and aunts and little nieces and nephews, had rented a house on the French border. I'm a little bit confused here. Here, in Mons, thinking that if we had to get away from home, we would stay in that house and the Germans would never get that far. And when my mother saw all these people streaming down the street, which really was a pitiful sight, she suddenly refused to go anyway. She said, if we leave our home, we're going to be just like these people, and we just, won't have anything or anywhere to go. And my father and the rest of the family tried to convince her that we should leave because things were going to be very bad. She refused for 2 days. And on the third day, one of my uncles came in and said, well, the last train to Brussels is leaving in the morning, and if we don't get on that train, we'll be right here when the Germans come in. So she finally gave in. In the meantime, she had started cooking dinner, and she had a big pot on the stove with chicken in it. She was going to do chicken soup. So suddenly we all flew out of there because she agreed to leave. We went to the station, caught the last train to Brussels, and started the trek towards Brussels, thinking it was the only train to take anyway. And Brussels is west, so you're getting away from the German border. Hoping that when we got to the station in Brussels, we could get a train to go down to Mons to that house that was waiting for us. We got on the train, and the distance between Liège and Brussels is 60 miles. That usually takes 1 hour to get to Brussels. It took us all day long. The train would move 2 or 3 yards, and the German planes were strafing the train all the time. all the way down. We'd move 2 or 3 yards and planes would come and shoot at the, I mean, it was terrible. We finally made it to Brussels and arrived at the station, and it was absolute pandemonium. There were people from everywhere. It was filled up with people. There was no train to Mons, there was no train to anywhere, and here we were in the middle of the station. My parents had some friends in Brussels, and my father was able to get in touch, and we spent the night at their home. So the next day, of course, everybody was trying to figure out what to do next. And everybody wanted to head west to go to the coast and catch a boat to England and get away that way. But we didn't know how we would get there. But we started. There was some means of conveyance like local trams or tramways, and we covered some distance that way. And the rest of the time we would be walking down the roads, and the roads were packed with people because everybody was doing the same thing. And the planes would come and strafe, and you would just hit the ditches to try to get away. One time, I have one sister who is a year and a half younger than I am. She jumped in a ditch, and there was a dead soldier right next to her. And we saw dead people everywhere. After we ran out of conveyances, we were walking. And the roads were full of civilians walking like we were. So somehow we finally got to the coast. There was no boat to go anywhere. And so the next thing you could do was maybe go down to France and get away that way, and maybe we could follow the coast and find some boat to go or get away anyway. So we were here, and we had a little tramway that was going down along the coast, and we arrived at the French border, which is La Panne. By then, 10 days, almost 10 days had gone by.
It's for the mic.
Sorry. Does that do it?
Yeah.
About 10 days had gone by since we had left home. And the Belgian army by then had capitulated. The king had given in because we're a country of 10 million people. We had the smallest army in the world. And here came Germany with all its might, with all its planes, with all its tanks. And there was no way they could hold them up anymore. Excuse me. I'm sorry. So when we got to the French border, we had to pass customs. And the French people were not very happy with the Belgians because they had capitulated and given in, and the French were going to save the world, and we had given in. But we finally made it across and started down the coastline. From here, we walked on this road right down here and past Dunkirk, and we walked all the way to Calais. And there were thousands of other people, and there were soldiers running back and forth and planes overhead most of the time. And we got to Calais, and everything along that coast was being bombed back constantly. Bridges were being blown up. Civilians had a hard time getting around all of that. In Calais, we ended up in the basement. It was an air raid shelter. They designated, basements and facilities as air shelters in big buildings because you were pretty well protected. We were spending the night there. There was one uncle and aunt with us. In other words, my mother, father, my sister and I, and an uncle and aunt. And my uncle left the basement and came back after a while. Everything was being bombed. Came back and said, I found a barge captain who says he's going to try to go to England. And he said, I'll be glad to take you. My father put some thought into it and said, you know, you have no children with you. He and his wife decided to go, and my father said, no, I'm not going to risk my children's life because the harbor was being bombed constantly. So they left, and we did not know for 6 months whether they made it to England or had been sunk or what happened. At this point in Calais, we heard that the Germans had encircled that whole area. We were caught in the pocket, and there wasn't any use to go south. We were going to be caught up by the Germans as soon as they pushed in towards the beaches. So there was nothing else to do except to turn around and try to go home. So we reversed and we started walking back north towards Belgium. And guess what? We arrived at Dunkirk when the British troops were being repatriated to England by all the little boats that they had sent out and some big boats also. And we were on the beaches with the British as they were filing down to go on the boats. If we looked over the dunes, we were right in the sand. When we looked over the dunes, we could see tanks fighting each other. There were planes overhead. We took refuge in an old nursing home that was somewhere up on one of the banks, and couldn't get on the boats at all. There were Belgian soldiers, there were French soldiers, there were everything was in total disarray. The next day, we kept going and came across the border back in Belgium, and we were in a small resort town of Coxie, very close to the border when the Germans came in. So no one really knew. And yet, I want you to know there were hundreds of other people in the same boat that we were in. Also, I forgot to tell you that between Calais and Dunkirk, we came to a place called Grand Fort Philippe. There was a big estuary there, an arm of the sea coming in, and there used to be a bridge across. And the bridge had been blown up, and the civilians were caught not able to go across this waterway. So the local fishermen lined up their fishing boats side by side and formed a bridge, and we jumped from one boat to the other to make it across. It's pretty traumatic. But when we were in this small resort town in Belgium, we got up, we were in the basement of a house that was unoccupied with other people. There were many resort homes that people didn't use except in the summertime, and they had opened up the homes for people to stay. So we got up the next morning, and the Germans were there, which everybody was not very happy and petrified. So what they did, they lined up huge trucks with a destination city marked on each truck. Like they had a truck marked Brussels, had one marked Antwerp, they had one marked Liège, which was our hometown. And it was the only way to go home, and they wanted us off the roads as fast as we could get away, and they could get us there, because they needed to move equipment. You gonna sit?
Everyone's worried about you. They want you to sit down.
Oh, it's terrible. I'll get them in a minute. So that is the way that we went home. We were piled up, everybody go to Liège, piled up in this big back truck, and we were taken back to Liège, and we made it home. And when we arrived home, the building was standing there. We went in the house. The pot of soup was on the stove. And my mother, who had almost been on the verge of a nervous breakdown for 3 weeks, witness and everything we had witnessed, said, see, if we'd stayed here like I wanted, nothing would have happened. That's kind of typical of mothers. Okay.
Lift your mic back. You have to lift it up a little towards your face.
Maybe by tomorrow I'll know how to use this thing. So we settled down. The Germans were everywhere. And life was fairly calm the whole time. I mean, not the whole time, at the beginning. They occupied, of course, every military building, you know, like casernes or, military installations. Their troops would march through town with their heavy boots. You've seen them in movies, singing their songs, and people were pretty petrified because it was just awful to have somebody like that, and everybody was scared of them. They started being pretty nice. They started buying up everything they could buy in every store of any good that they could ship back to Germany, because the German people actually had probably not had too much while they were building up their armies and all this good stuff. The only bad thing is they printed paper that was shaped like money, had absolutely no worth. It was just printed out, and everybody had to accept it. So they kind of stripped every store out of everything they could ship back. And gradually they imposed some rules. The farmers had to be on quotas. They had to produce so much for the Germans and only so little for the people. Everybody, of course, was on rations, and I can assure you there was very, very little. And there were resistance had started forming, but it was, of course, very, very dangerous and very underground. Things relatively calmed the first year, and then they started with everything else. And of course, I'm Jewish, and we had heard about a number of things that had happened in Poland and even in Germany. And we certainly did not know what would happen to us. And by the second year of occupation, they started imposing some, we had a curfew imposed on us where we couldn't be outside after 7 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning. They didn't do it all at once, but it was a gradual thing. They had Jewish people had to all register their addresses and their religion, of course. And so they had complete lists. And the Jewish population in Belgium was quite small, very small. And Belgium was always very tolerant towards any religion. Protestant, Catholics, of course, were the big majority in Belgium. Protestants and Jewish people and a few Muslims who were there. And Belgian people don't practice their religion like the Americans do, for instance. They don't support their churches to the point where a minister was able to live on what income he could draw from that. So the government would subsidize any priest or any preacher from any religion or rabbi so that they could practice their own religions. But of course the Germans' view was different. So they had a curfew, and then I was in my last year of college preparatory, 6 years, and you had to declare a major, more or less, and I was in ancient humanities. So I had 6 years of Latin and 5 years of ancient Greek and English, which is where I learned to speak English. And I spoke German too, plus every other subject that you can imagine. Our schools were very, very rigid. No sports connected with the school, except for gymnastics. And they decided that by January 1, 1942, no Jewish child could attend school with the other children. I was 5 months from graduating, which was the equivalent of a junior college degree. I could not go to school anymore. Couldn't take my exams, couldn't do anything. They made the excuse that they were going to form schools for the Jewish children. There were few Jewish children, but still. And it was going to be taught by qualified Jewish teachers. And there weren't that many Jewish teachers either. So that was all just a sham. I mean, that never came to be. Then almost immediately you had to wear a yellow star on your outer garment when you went out, which a lot of people balked at, but if they were caught not wearing it, it was bad news. And you couldn't just pin it on, it had to be sewn on, because it didn't want you to be able to remove it. And that was all happening in 42. And then in May of 42, they started grabbing every family they could. They had every address, and they would just come and grab people. We had some wonderful neighbors who were basically all Christian. We had a lot of good friends. There was a neighbor, a good friend of ours, who lived next door, and her daughter had been a student. Her daughter was older than we were. Had been a student at a Catholic boarding school in a town called Wavre, which is south of Brussels. Somebody ought to show it up.
Oh, there's Brussels, see the big circle?
Yeah. And she came to my parents and said, you know, I'm going to go talk to the Mother Superior and see if she will take me and my sister in as students. She also owned a summer home in a small town, country town outside of Liège. And the mayor of that town was part of the underground. First of all, she said, you go straight to my house in Sprimont. And the day after we left our home in Liège, the Germans were at our door. And even in her summer home, nobody knew we were there. Real identity. In Belgium, everybody had to have an identity card, just like we use our driver's license here. You had to have your picture on it and your address. And the Germans, in the year previous to that, had stamped every Jewish person's card with the name Jew. So that, you know, and you always had to carry that with you. It was the law, so that if anybody asked you for your identity card, you had to show it. So the mayor of that little town produced new identity cards for us, real ones, but with forged names. Okay?
It'll be words later.
I'm sorry. And the Mother Superior talked to the priest who served that congregation, and they agreed to take us. So, and then out of this village of Sprimont, there was a private property which belonged to a lawyer in my hometown. And it was like a hunting property, lots of woods, and in the middle of the woods was a chalet. And he had a caretaker who ran a big farm also. I don't know if I described this properly. But the person who was managing that property was also part of the underground. So he took my parents and gave him the chalet to live in. And my sister and I took off to WWII and made it to the school, which was also a convent. It was run by about 25 nuns and a Mother Superior and so on. It was a French order of nuns. And we became part of the student body. Okay? So I was way ahead in my schooling of any child there. They had grammar school and high school, but it was more geared to business courses and typing, and there was a little machine you like to use in the courtrooms to, I don't know what they call it. Yeah, it was like a stenography, yeah. And typing and things I never had learned. So we blended in with the students there, and everything was quiet, more or less, except you were scared to death all the time that somebody was going to suspect something, and none of the nuns knew that we were Jewish, just the Mother Superior and her assistants and the priest. And we went to Mass every morning. I mean, with all the other kids, and of course with my 6 years of Latin, I knew the Mass from one end. And I was probably the only one with it. Maybe the nuns do, but the priest who knew exactly. And when they changed the Mass from Latin to English or French, I was very upset. I thought the Latin Mass was beautiful, but anyway, any Catholics here? Well, you know what I'm talking about. So we were, you know, we were René and Jacqueline, and we weren't Regine and Sasha like my sister was. So everything was fairly quiet. We had a hard time communicating with our parents, except when holiday time came, like Easter or Christmas, and every other child went home for the holidays. Because in Belgium, you usually have 2 weeks at Easter and 2 weeks at Christmas. There would have been a suspicion by anybody, either the students or even the nuns, how come René and Jacqueline had gone home for the holidays? So we really had to leave. And we would take the chance and take the train and join our parents during that period of time. And we would ride the train because it was the only way you could do it. And instead of going directly through my hometown, which would have been the most direct way, but we were in fear that somebody might recognize us, so we couldn't go that way. So we would go from, I can't see that map. We could go from Wavre down here into the Ardennes and back up where my parents were in Sprimont. We had changed train. Now the Ardennes is where a lot of farms and farmers live. It's a beautiful part of the country. It's got a lot of woods and farming, and a lot of Belgian people would ride those trains with empty suitcases and go to farms and try to buy butter and whatever, flour, whatever they could bring back, because the rations were so small that you needed to supplement with whatever you could get. But of course, it was against the law. So the Germans would raid the trains occasionally, going down and going back. So a couple of times, Jacqueline and I got caught in these raids, and the train would stop in the middle of the country, and you'd have Germans standing outside on both sides of the train, soldiers, just like you've seen that in the movies. And two officers would come out to every car, and you would have to present your identity papers, and you have to open your suitcases to show that you didn't smuggle any kind of food that you weren't supposed to have. So we would be caught in that, and of course we didn't have any food smuggled, but we were scared to death that would decide that we were Jewish and that we were going to be picked up. By the grace of God, that didn't happen. But you can imagine the fear, and you have to keep a straight face. And so anyway, we would see our parents occasionally just because of that. And the war went on until 44, but Easter of 44, everybody was talking about, the Americans were going to land, something was going to happen. About that time, just before that, Mother Superior and I had been very good friends. She was wonderful to me and to everybody. And she called me in one day and she said, I know you're bored to tears. She said, there's a young lawyer living next door and he's looking for a secretary. And she said, would you like to take the job and work with him? That'll give you something different than sitting here. So I said, yeah, I'd be glad to. So I started working there, let's say about March. And when Easter vacations came, because I had a job, I wasn't going to leave. I had to stay there, but my sister had to leave. So that was just before the landing of the Americans, and they were bombing all over Belgium. And there was a big railway center very close to where the convent was, where Wavre. And during the vacation, they bombed that whole railroad center because they were trying to disrupt the transportation for the Germans, to get away. And a lot of people got hurt during that bombing because they just kind of blanket the whole area. They don't just hit the target always. And the convent had been designated as a first aid center because they had great big halls in the place and they had beds and cots. So they started bringing all the wounded there. And the doctors came, and I was helping the doctor sew up somebody's arm. And I was surprised to find out that you can do that without morphine. If you do it right after it happened, you evidently don't feel too much pain. But I learned all kinds of stuff. Well, I also, in the convent, learned how to iron a man's shirt and starch linens and art knitting and a little bit of typing. But anyway, I also coached a young nun in ancient Greek. She was going through, so I did a little bit of everything. So anyway, during that Easter holiday, I was the only one there of the children, so-called, with the nuns.
How old were you then?
I was 18 or 19. And that was just fine. And during the bombing, I saw the nuns for the first time without the hats on. And they were running around. But anyway, it was kind of always interesting. So anyway, nobody came back from that holiday because everybody was expecting something, and there was a lot of bombing going on. And then one day, Mother Superior calls me in and she says, "Renee, the Americans have landed." I said, "Oh, wonderful." And she said, "You know, I don't feel good about you being here away from your parents because we don't know exactly what's going to happen." And she said, "I'll tell you what, tomorrow morning there is a truck coming here from Namur." I'm sorry. Anyway, it was pretty good ways from Brussels. She said, "They're bringing some food stuff." And she said, and I had my bicycle at the convent. And she said, "You know, you could ride, I can ask them to take you and your bicycle on the truck till Namur. And then you could catch the little railway that goes from Namur to Huy. And then you'd be on your own with your bicycle. But you know the way, the back roads, and you could get back to your parents." I said, "Okay." So I did, and from Huy, do you see Huy? I went to, no, I don't see it. Well, anyway, I rode my bicycle for 6 hours after I got off the little train. And the little train had a platform, you know, like the old railroad cars had on the back, and that's where my bicycle, sorry, that's what my bicycle was, and I was in the car. And then I got off in Huy, and I rode, and the German trucks and the planes, they were flying all over the place. I just kept riding. And by 6 o'clock at night, I had joined my parents, who didn't know I was coming. And so from that point on, the four of us stayed together because we were expecting the Americans to show up. And sure enough, they had landed, and they were moving, you know, Patton was moving like crazy to France till they ran out of gas. And my father, which was terrible, had a great big map on the wall with pinheads marking. He was listening to London, telling them the progress of the armies and moving the pins everywhere. And we sat there until September before the Americans arrived where we were. And I will tell you this. We got up one morning in this farmhouse by the chalet, and we could hear this loud roar. Sounded like 100 airplanes overhead. So my sister and I went out and looked in the sky, and there wasn't anything. And this farmhouse was sitting like on a bluff a little bit, Then there was a valley going down with a creek at the bottom, and the road came back up, and there was a small highway, almost at the same level as the farmhouse. And then we realized the noise was coming from there. So she and I ran down the woods, through the creek and up the road, and we come up on the edge of the road, and there's a convoy. There's a convoy. And we stand there, we don't know who they are. We knew they weren't the British, because the British had flat helmets, you know, and these were not flat. There were tanks, and there were jeeps and trucks, and there was a white star on the side, and we said, well, it's not the Russians, because they had a red star. So all at once a jeep came by, and the German officer was strapped to the hood, spread eagle. And we said, oh, it's the Americans. So we stood there, we were just beaming. One of them threw me a cigarette. And I'll never forget it was a Chesterfield. And I was smoking at that time. My father was sharing his ration with me. And I took one draft of this Chesterfield, and I almost passed out. But suddenly my sister and I looked at each other and said, we're going to run back and tell them the Americans are here. So we ran back down the woods and up the hill. And when we got to the farmhouse, there were German soldiers in the front yard. But they were in total disarray. They were just trying to get away. So that was the story. And we went back home in Liège, and the Germans started. The war was not over. It was still going on in eastern Belgium, and parts of Germany, of course. And they started throwing buzz bombs. Do you know what buzz bombs are? V2, V1 and V2, the rockets. They were shooting rockets all over London. Everybody knows that. But a lot of people don't know they were shooting them in my hometown, Liège, and Antwerp, which is a big harbor in Belgium. And these things were coming over every hour on the hour, night and day. You never knew when they were going, where they were going to land, when they were going to explode, or anything. The motor would cut off, and then there'd be silence for 10, 15, 20 seconds, and usually hit homes, in the town. So I wanted to go back to school, where they didn't open the schools, because they didn't want any concentration of students anywhere while these things were flying overhead. So I was very bored, and finally told my parents, I'm going to find me a job or something till school starts. And I did, and I went to work. I spoke English then fluently. And I was offered a job at a quartermaster depot. There was a huge quartermaster depot outside of town, very close, in the suburb. And I was given a job as a translator in the legal department, and I was head of a typist group. We'll have to tie this thing to me. I'm sorry.
You're doing great.
Okay, so anyway, I worked there, and that's where I met my husband.
And the rest is history.
And then there was the Battle of the Bulge that came right after that. And that was one reason they were throwing these buzz bombs on Liège, because it's very, very close to the Ardennes where the battle took place. So they came so close to our hometown that my father said, we're not staying here, we're not going through this again. And we went to Brussels for Christmas that year and stayed at some of their friends' home. And then, of course, the vote was over and I came back.
And here you are.
Any questions?
How old were you when you got married?
I was 20
And how old before you moved to the United States?
before I did what?
Moved to the United States?
I moved to the States in 1947, so I was 23. Nancy was, our oldest daughter was born in Belgium. My husband was still in the army in Germany. And we couldn't travel until she was 8 or 9 months old. And there were no civilian transports of any kind, airplane or ships or anything. I tried, but I ended up having to come with the army. And so it was a heck of a trip. We were riding a Liberty ship, if anybody's been on one of those. And we hit the biggest storms in the Atlantic. I lost 10 pounds. I mean, it was a trip. Anyway, we're here.
Welcome.
Thank you. Well, I've only been in Salem 59 years. I hope
Saltville, Virginia. Yeah.
Did your aunt and uncle ever make it across?
Yes, they did. And we received a message from the Red Cross from Switzerland about 6 months after they had left, that they made it and they spent the rest of the war in Liverpool in England and came back to Belgium after the war.
We do have a family picture taken in 1934, and I'd say with children and uncles and aunts, you probably lost 30% of that picture who were hauled off to Auschwitz, and children included, so others didn't make it.
Yep.
So you are the positive side of the war. Here you are.
By the grace of God. I don't know, we were so fortunate to have a mother and father and 2 children, remain as a family unit without, because so many others didn't. It was pretty bad.
When you were traveling from one place to another, walking, how did you get food and water?
Well, you have to be a refugee to understand that. You get water where you can. There were lines at the bakeries in the little villages everywhere you went. If you were close enough to the door, you might have gotten a loaf of hot bread right out of the oven. If you were further down the line, they'd run out of flour and run out of bread. You would pass farmhouses where many of the farmers' wives would have a huge kettle of soup cooking just in the front of the yard, just feeding people who were coming through. And one time I'll never forget it, we had a loaf or half a loaf of gingerbread and a can of sardines. Now you put those 2 things I mean, it didn't matter. You usually found people who gave you shelter, and there are some good peoples in the world too. There are a lot of bad ones, but I remember sleeping in barns. People were lined up like, one next to the other sleeping. I remember in the middle of the night, one guy saying, people would get up to go out or whatever, and I hear him say in the dark, please, please, walk on my head, or walk on me, but don't walk on my feet. We'd been walking so much, their feet were killing them. And ours too. So there you go. And here I am in Salem, Virginia.
Were you able to maintain contact with the Mother Superior at the convent?
I did many times after the war, and of course they were quite older than I was, and they passed on, and I have correspondence even from her to this day, that they always stayed in touch after the war, too. Yeah, they were very, very nice.
We visited the school just a couple of years ago.
Right.
Too, and there were some older women there who remembered.
Some of the nuns that I knew, yeah. Right. It really was. Yeah, we made a special trip. Jackie was with me that day. And my sister. And my sister. My sister lives in Brussels. She never left Belgium. And she has her family over there like I have mine here. And the good thing is, my children know her children, and we stay in contact. Yeah. Yes.
I think I can speak for everybody in this room that your story needs to be heard by a very much larger audience. It's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you all.
Thank you all so much for coming. We have just